Good morning, I am C1C Liam Connolly.
C2C Mason Royce.
C2C Austin Coleman.
And C3C Moira Casey.
We are the 2019 USAFA Military Ethics Case Competition Team. This is our presentation on addressing moral harm.
So first we're going to discuss the definition of moral harm and some of its causes and effects in order to allow us to try and mitigate these. Next we're going to discuss how we currently address this in our military, and then move into how we believe it should be addressed in our military in a three-stage process. First, how we train pre-deployment, during deployment, and then post-deployment. So first, what is moral harm? Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Wood stated that moral harm is a violation of one's fundamental sense of right and wrong. But to give more of a tangible definition, moral harm is the inability to reconcile your identity with the actions that you've committed. In the military, this most often looks like being unable to reconcile your identity as a moral actor and with your own moral compass with the actions you were often forced to commit in war because of necessity or to follow orders. This can also look like being unable to prevent atrocities or having to witness atrocities and reconciling this with your warrior identity and being unable to stop them. So this has several causes. The general cause of moral harm is an inability to come to terms with the baseness of mankind that you often see during war. But there are several specific instances which can cause moral harm, which cause a greater amount, and these should try to be mitigated. The first would be fighting an unjust war. And it's not really about whether or not the war itself is inherently unjust. It's about the individual's understanding of that war's cause as just or unjust, and then being able to attribute each of the things that they had to do to that just or unjust cause. Additionally, any unnecessary killing, unnecessary suffering, or unnecessary damage which would be caused by the individual or which the individual could not prevent during that war would cause moral harm because they can't attribute these actions to the cause of war and don't see them as justified. Additionally, they could even commit a completely just act, but if they did so for motives they don't consider to be just, such as killing and taking any pleasure in that killing or killing for revenge. This causes moral harm down the road because they can't reconcile that with their own identity. And lastly, returning home to an apathetic society. Vietnam is an excellent case study for this, as many of the soldiers who returned home were labeled baby killers by society and looked down upon. And as a result, they couldn't reconcile their own identity as a just moral actor and as a combatant with the way the society saw them. So this causes several effects, which really affect mission readiness and which need to be mitigated in our military. The first would be a denigration of one's virtue. If one's moral compass is repeatedly questioned during a combat situation, then that shakes the foundation upon which you decide how to make your decisions. And as a result, you can often stray from your moral compass. Additionally, if your moral compass is repeatedly violated, you can become numb to it, and additionally, these decisions are strayed. And we have lots of examples of individuals who, throughout war, have crossed the lines of conduct or crossed even ROEs. There are examples of individuals in Vietnam cutting off the fingers or mutilating the bodies of the people they had killed, or committing mistreatment of prisoners, committing any actions which were against the ROEs because they suffered moral harm and because their moral virtue was violated. This comes from an inability to reconcile the actions and causes after the action, either regret or remorse. And there's an important distinction between the two. Regret would be, I wish that I hadn't had to commit that action, but I do see that action as just. And this is an indication of moral harm. But a much greater indication of moral harm, and one that causes a lot more damage, would be remorse, which would be, I wish that I hadn't committed that action because I know that it wasn't just. And I can't now reconcile that with my own identity. Now, this is very strongly linked to PTSD, but we want to make it clear that PTSD and moral harm are very different. In PTSD, this often occurs because of a suffered trauma. However, moral harm does not need that trauma. It's all about your identity and reconciling that with your actions. However, several studies have been conducted which show that if you have PTSD and moral harm in conjunction, this is a very strong indicator of suicide attempts. The first would be the study by the American Psychological Association, which showed that in National Guardsmen, those who suffered from PTSD and moral harm shared one symptom, and that would be depression. But in any individuals who had either, it was a statistically significant predictor of suicide risk. The Journal of Military Medicine next conducted a study in which they found that those who were suffering PTSD symptoms and also had moral harm were much, much more likely to have suicidal ideation and actually attempt to commit suicide. Lastly, the University of Southern Alabama, the University of Nevada, and the Fuller Theological Seminary together conducted a study showing that in those who had PTSD, if they also suffered moral harm, it didn't matter what religion they subscribed to. Religiosity had no effect. What did have an effect was whether or not they suffered and experienced symptoms of moral harm, and this predicted whether or not they would commit suicide. So this really decreases our mission readiness and creates a culture in the Air Force where we can't really grieve together, and we have to turn, and individuals feel that they have to turn to things like suicide. So we need to figure out how to mitigate these risks.
Before we jump into what the military is currently doing to address this issue, or what our policy recommendation will be to fix this issue, we want to sit down and address who are the stakeholders in this situation. And the two largest ones we came to terms with are the entire DoD, because as the future progresses, we move more and more to a joint coalition force. And through that, just like Newton's second law, every action has an opposite but equal reaction. If we have harm on one front, it can manifest itself on the other. So we need to take care of each other. And further, we have the American citizen, whose interest is to protect its military as much as it's the military's job to protect us. So when we sat down and really looked at what the military is currently doing, we were shocked with the results. We found there is only one medical facility with one program, San Diego Navy Medical Facility, that opened in 2013 to address moral harm as an issue. It has great findings and we're working for it, but that is not the demand that the people need. The VA and the DoD need to address this issue, much larger concept than just one organization. So if we come down and narrow it to the individual soldier pre-deployment, we found that most of the time it's as simple as, hey, please watch this PowerPoint, sign here when you're done. Then you go to your pre-deployment medical doctor checkup, and as we've all been a victim of military medicine, we know it's how sad do you feel the past 60 days, 0 to 10. It's a lot of impersonal questions. You fill out a flyer, and it honestly just feels like you're checking the box to keep going. While you're on deployment, we find there are opportunities to mourn and express grief, but it's not as pronounced as we need to do. And that's something we intentionally need to target, is the culture. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. Furthermore, we have the ROEs, which again, is something that's addressed, but not the gravity that we need to put on the emphasis. And finally, post-deployment, just like pre-deployment, it's an impersonal doctor visit where you feel like you're checking the boxes. And so when we sat down, like, how are we gonna fix this issue? What are we gonna do? We had to make 3 assumptions. 1, we assume for the scenario presented that we are fighting in a just war. 2, what can we do as unit officers and leaders to help our soldiers? And 3, we realized that 1, it needs to be a culture change, and 2, this is a call for leadership. And we found pre-deployment, the best things to do is instruct every leader of grief leadership. Now when I say every leader, I'm not just talking about officers and NCOs throughout the unit, but I'm talking about the peer leadership, which is natural born leaders that everyone gravitates to in the unit. And when I say grief leadership, I understand that sounds like a military buzzword, but what it means is we're going to remove suffering alone. We're not going to leave someone in isolation when they encounter something that challenges them morally, or they have to encounter difficulty. They need to have someone they can respect and turn to and express those feelings and grow and recapture their moral identity. Now, Thomas Hobbes famously writes in Leviathan about the state of nature. The life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. ROEs are what keep us from that state of nature. And while someone's moral compass might be here, the ROEs are here. And that is the line we cannot descend across, we cannot falter behind. ROEs need to be re-examined and reinforced in every individual's mind, as this is the line we will not cross. This is our moral foundation, and it keeps us separate from animals. And finally, we need to train every individual for shifts in identity to help them realize that they are going to encounter difficult, challenging, questioning circumstances where they're going to have a hard time sleeping at night. When that gaze in the mirror turns back on them, it lasts a little bit longer and it's a little more judgmental than they're used to. And they need to prepare. And part of that, again, is the call to leadership. Every single person in the unit needs to be that grief leader, needs to be instructed on how to handle it, how to be able to go to one another and express those feelings of grief and sorrow. And again, that is a culture change that is being demanded by our individuals. And it's a call to leadership that we all must answer.
So looking at policy recommendations for the during deployment phase, justification for each mission. So when we talked about this a little bit before, but a soldier's understanding of why they're going to do what they're going to do, or why they did what they did, and whether or not it was just, is more important than the overall consensus on whether or not the war was just. Because moral harm is something that happens on a very personal level. That is why commanders should seek to the best of their ability, inform the soldiers why they're doing what they're doing, and explain why it's a just action. Similarly, ROEs are morally based, but real applications of those morals. So by not enforcing ROEs, as a commander, You're telling all of your subordinates that you do not stand for a moral truth, you do not stand for a moral right or wrong, and therefore how can they be assured that you actually are acting in a just way and they're acting in a just way if, as a commander, you don't show them that you act in a just way because you don't believe in a moral right or wrong. And as Austin talked about earlier, brief leadership is removing suffering alone. Now, you cannot remove suffering, but you can remove the alone part by encouraging discussions incorporated in the post-mission hot wash. So by allowing the soldiers to voice what they've seen, voice what they feel immediately after the mission, that prevents them having to go to bed with these thoughts on their mind. It lets them, as a unit, just discuss what's going on, what they're thinking, and they can be there for each other. Similarly, encouraging mourning, rather than trying to internalize everything. I think as a military, a lot of times we want to stereotype ourselves as invincible, and while and I'm sure everyone would love to be invincible, that's just not the fact of life. And so by encouraging mourning, encouraging getting help when you need help, as a commander specifically, you send a message that, hey, it is okay to feel this way, and please, like, we value you, please get help. So another thing Moira talked about is that returning home to an apathetic society can increase instances of moral harm. Logistically, it is impossible to train an entire society on how to not be apathetic about something. However, you can train the service member's family or close loved ones on how to best receive them when they return home. So ideally, in the weeks building up to the return, families will meet with a specialist who's an expert on these things and go over things like what experiences their loved ones might have had, because their loved ones might not be ready to talk about what they've seen or what they've heard, and nor should they be forced to. And that should be something that should be communicated to the family, because a lot of times forcing a victim of moral harm to talk about what they have experienced or what they've gone through can increase the severity or increase instances of moral harm. And then also what to expect. The truth of it is the person who left for deployment and the person who comes back is not going to be the same person a lot of the time. At their core, they're probably the same, but just that adjustment into regular civilian life is going to be a little bit of transition. So if they're distant, their family should know to expect that and understand that it's just part of the process. And how to discuss sensitive topics and how to react. Bottom line, don't judge, and just let your service member know that you love them, you're there for them, and you understand, and you want help.
So now we're looking at some of the policy recommendations for our program in the post-deployment timeframe. The first piece of that would be a delayed transition from the theater with the company. And we actually drew this idea from author Dave Grossman's work on killing, in which he compared the experiences of soldiers returning home from the Second World War with those returning home from Vietnam. And in the case of World War II, soldiers took weeks to get back from either the Pacific or European theater. And in that time frame, they were on ships with their fellow soldiers or Marines or company mates, and they were maintaining that sense of camaraderie or esprit de corps which had developed during the war. And they were also very slowly transitioning from one identity to another. Whereas in Vietnam, when soldiers came back, they were put on planes, and then within days, they were back in the United States. They were forced to abruptly abandon that unit with whom they had just experienced war, and they were almost overnight forced to shift from one identity to another. The system we have in place today is much more similar to that of Vietnam. So our proposal would be taking soldiers, and before they get back to the United States, they would spend time at Ramstein Air Base, Germany. And we fully understand the desire that most every soldier would have to get back home, get back to normalcy, see their family and friends. So this time frame wouldn't exceed 7 days. We would try and keep them as productive as possible. They would do things like intelligence debriefs, working on continuity of operations plans for the unit replacing them in the field. They could also work on some of the other post-deployment taskers, such as identity training. This would look like conversations with specialists and groups of peers, in which soldiers could talk about how they're going to reconcile some of the actions that they may have taken during war with their personal identity. They would also have conversations about how to go back to the identity that they'll have to reassume once they return home versus the identity that they may have assumed during times of war. They would also be required to put together a personal plan in which they're going to come up with solutions for identity-related issues that may arise moving forward. Beyond that, the families would put their training into effect. And also, once we got back to the United States, the officers and NCO, the leadership of this company, they would be working with outside organizations such as, say, the American Legion or Veterans of Foreign Wars in order to help build a community in which our soldiers can fit within. As Mara talked about earlier, instances of moral harm, the issues can be exacerbated if soldiers find themselves in a specific community or society at large which is apathetic or doesn't quite understand their experiences. So we would want to build a community or a network of people, that have a certain level of understanding or appreciation for what these people have sacrificed and what they've gone through. So we're going to try to put together events like networking events or just generally opportunities to meet people and build relationships with people who have an understanding and appreciation for the experiences that these soldiers may have gone through. On the leadership side of things, the officers and NCOs in this time period would assume the responsibility to maintain communication with their soldiers. This could take the form of emails, text messages, phone calls, or better yet, sitting down in person and having conversations. And we wouldn't want this to just be another box to check on a long laundry list of responsibilities for officers or NCOs. So they wouldn't have a specific set number of times that they would have to contact a specific soldier, but rather we would have to generate a culture in which these kinds of things would happen organically. And based on these conversations, leadership could get a sense for who's adjusting well versus who's struggling. And if that's the case, they could direct them sort of towards some further form of help. And one form that help could take is community service. And research produced by King's College London suggests that when you have groups of people who have experienced something horrific like war, the best way for them to rehabilitate is to get back together with that same group of people and rebuild or do something positive. So one thing that we would want to do is take a group of soldiers and then task them with putting together a community service project, like working with children or rebuilding homes outside of the specific community in which they live. And to be clear, this wouldn't just be a requirement or task or a punishment for those who are suffering. We would want to take a diverse group of soldiers, some who are doing really well, some who may be struggling, some who fall in between on that spectrum, and have them all work together to accomplish this goal. So these are the specific effects that we're trying to achieve with our overall policy. And ultimately, we're just trying to ease that transition from the deployed environment back to life at home. Earlier, we talked about some of the more scientific, medical-based mental health issues associated with moral harm. And research has shown that soldiers returning from the wars in the Middle East are suffering from mental issues such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and then turning to things like suicide or substance abuse as a means of coping. And so what we would ultimately like to do with our program is mitigate these issues before they arise. However, we understand the limitations of this program, which is why we include post-deployment safety nets as a means of treating these issues in the long term as they arrive down the line. We also understand that the Army has a selfish interest in maintaining mental fitness of its soldiers, because ultimately if people aren't mentally fit, they can't do their jobs well. So investing in a program like this would be an investment in ensuring long-term mission readiness and making sure that our country's soldiers can continue to fight and win our wars. And altogether, what we're ultimately trying to do is affect a culture shift. We want to transition from a culture in which it is stigmatized to seek help for mental health, where it's not necessarily understood what your options or resources are, to one where leadership and peers alike can turn to people and say, here are your options, this is what you can do, and it's completely normal to seek help for these types of issues. Slide, please. These are some of the sources that we based our research and our presentation upon, but now we'd be happy to open it up to questions. Yes, sir.
I particularly like the post-rise, prior to post-deployment, with getting the families and counseling the families, because from my understanding of suicides by veterans, there's three principal reasons why they tend to do that. The first is relationships and failure of relationships. The second is financial, and the third is legal. So my question is, who gets these families together and who does this?
So, sir, we would have, whenever the individual is going to be returning back, we would have the unit or the base that the person is stationed in, contact these families and say, please come and attend this training, which will help you to allow your service member to come back and transition more effectively, allow you to keep the relationship strong, as you mentioned, and help that relationship not to fail by giving them the ability to expect that they're going to be distant, they're going to be working through things, but then it will, that transition period will end, but this is how you can help them through it.
Now,
So
I think that's very important, because that makes
Yes,
me
sir.
an area that people tend to overlook,
yes, sir.
the whole family connection.
Got two questions for you. Radical's in about 140 BC has a great quote, out of 100 men, 10 shouldn't be there, 80 are targets, 9 do most of the fighting, and 1's a warrior that takes them there and back. So, considering you've got 10 people doing most of the fighting and facing most of the negative experiences or combat stress, what specifically are you gonna do in the combat zone forward to ensure there's not moral failure among those?
Well, I think that this is where a lot of the peer-to-peer training will come into play. And then we talked a lot about talking about ROEs beforehand and then ROEs during deployment as well. And so if you can have a level of understanding or appreciation for those ROEs, not just among company level leadership, the officers or NCOs, but just the peer-to-peer appreciation where they can keep each other accountable in all instances rather than just relying on upper leadership to do so. I think that that would help mitigate those potential issues.
Further, sir, that's why we wanted to elaborate on eliminating suffering and isolation. And that's why those peer-to-peer grief leadership training is so important. Because if you're in a combat situation, you notice your wingman, your battle buddy is suffering and something's come up, you have that ability and that training to rely upon to help pull them out of their own suffering that they're having, their own hell, their own Dante's Inferno, and be able to guide them back to the light, bring them back into the familial unit that you have become employed by.
Additionally, sir, if it's only 10 people doing the actual fighting, it's almost guaranteed that the bond that those 10 people make is going to be stronger than maybe the rest of the 80. And therefore, they'll have a much tighter circle on which they can rely on each other. So I would wager that they'd be more likely to talk about that with each other.
Second question is, what's the relationship of sleep to moral resiliency? And what's your obligation as the commander or leader to ensure adequate individual and unit sleep?
So they say that the less sleep that you get, the more difficult it is to control your emotions and to make critical decisions and to critically think. So that's definitely a concern, and we didn't necessarily address it specifically here, but sleep and ensuring that people are making the correct decisions would be up to that, again, grief leadership, that moral leadership. What we're trying to foster is a community in which the individuals are talking with each other about these issues and looking out for each other. So that would be up to the leaders and the officers and NCOs to look out for each individual. And part of what we set up in the, discussing with your peers about all this would be being able to keep a better eye on each other. So if you know that an individual is struggling with this, being able to keep a better eye on them because you've had these discussions and ensuring that they are getting the correct amount of sleep, that they are, eating well, that they are maintaining a healthy lifestyle to try and mitigate some of the moral harm they're experiencing. That would be a lot easier if you are able to keep these discussions going and to have, as part of post-mission hot washes, the ability to figure out how everyone is doing in that. And if an individual is really struggling, maybe allow them to, switch around their shifts so they can get more sleep. That's a great point.
So what I think I heard, the implication of what you just said is intrusive, directive leadership to ensure adequate sleep for your individuals and units.
I would elaborate on that, sir. It's just like we mentioned, the call to leadership. This is a time, especially in today's society, that leaders need to emerge and they need to get after each other. And while it does affect sleep, and it's the leader's job and responsibility to ensure all their people are taken care of. Sorry, I almost just said airmen, but I don't want to discriminate against all services. But it's also their job to make sure that they're getting fed enough, that they're hydrated enough, that all the logistics are taken care of. And unfortunately, that's the call to leadership. Is if I have an airman who's suffering, I'm going to suffer so he can go rest and recover. And his moral compass is reorganized, and he's able to take care of himself. And that's the challenge of being not just a service academy, but being any military member, is willing to bleed for another man or woman.
And so we would hope this wouldn't be intrusive, but instead relationship-based. So because you can build a relationship with that person, you can say, hey, I noticed that you're struggling. I would like to switch this around. But it would hopefully not be, I order you to go get more sleep because I know that you're struggling morally. This would be relationship-based because introducing that sort of authoritative and intrusive leadership into it would ruin that relationship instead.
Thank you.
Something I didn't hear enough about, maybe I missed the details, but how are you going to ensure that your people will fight effectively and minimize their own casualties? And that's an important part of this. I didn't get a feeling for what kind of pre-deployment training you got for desensitization, making sure they recognize the threats, making sure they hit the right targets, shoot at the right time. So how do you do that?
Sir, I think what we really want to focus on is we think the military does an extensive job of training people for combat, and we did not want to alter that as it is now, but we really wanted to emphasize the most important aspect of leadership, which is love. And we think all leadership is derived from love. Well, all good leadership is derived from love. And through that, you can rebuild and reconnect and retrain. It doesn't matter if I am terrified out of my mind. If I know my leader loves me and is going to die for me and bleed for me, I'm going to overcome every ounce of fear I have to pursue the mission, to engage in combat, to do the tough things. And so we didn't want to alter what we already do well. We recognize that yes, pre-deployment combat training is very effective. We're the best in the world at it, best in history at it. But what we need to really integrate is a change in culture and make sure our leaders are driving out of a place of love.
And additionally, to ensure that in creating these discussions on moral harm, we don't make it so that they can no longer effectively fight, as you're saying. In a lot of those discussions, pre-deployment, it would be about the justification. So why is it justified in killing in this way?
I would take some credit in your brief for your combat readiness in that. And love is terrific. I just remind you that there's an old adage that says, you always hurt the one you love.
You say.
You said in there, one of your comments was the officer-NCO connection and commitment to start with all the way through. And we note that in ways of measuring, we notice you are struggling, I think were the words used. What are the tells? How do you know?
To clarify your question, so you're asking what are the tells to know if
Yeah.
an individual is suffering with moral harm?
So if you're the commander and you and your NCOs are monitoring this, what are you looking for? And how do you train the leadership to understand that?
I think that's a very rough thing, but through our research, we've shown that moral harm has very similar symptoms that are displayed as PTSD, and the treatment option is completely different for both. And so as that part of the grief leadership training is being able to recognize in your subordinates, okay, I know how he acted for 2 years when we were on post back in the West. Something's different, and being able to have those constant conversations. And that's what our whole program is about, is making sure those relationships are firm and strong, and we have very strong interpersonal skills, and we can recognize when someone is off. And through that, again, that's the call to leadership, that's the call to love, is to have that passion for your subordinates, and the desire to want what's best for them, and being able to recognize when they're missing a step or missing a beat.
Just two quick questions. One, I understand the policy, right? Policies at every different level. What's the timeline for the plan? Did you have that involved, or is that flexible, or is that yet to be established?
So when we were integrating this and we sat down as a group, we realized that pre-deployment is a hectic time. And so we wanted to add to the checklist. I know we made fun of checklists and checking the marks, but we feel like, hey, we can't just make this an optional thing, but it needs to be at the top of the pre-deployment checklist. So pre-deployment, ideally, we have 3 separate individual times where, the first we introduce the concept of grief leadership and we're pulling aside the established leaders and ensuring they're getting extra focus. The second time you bring everyone together and you're starting to really work on those interpersonal skills. And the third is 7 days before you actually leave and make sure everyone's packed, ready to go. They're saying goodbye to their loved ones properly. And then we thought during deployment, it would be every week that there would be a set aside time for everyone to come together and express that grief and emotion. And then post-deployment, just like we established, is that it's on the jobs of the leaders of the NCOs and the officers, and just peer-to-peer communication in every form in a digital age. Text, call, email, just go up and knock on their door, both times, and just make sure they're doing okay, and see through the mask they may put on.
Second question real quickly. Values and ethics of the Air Force Academy, how do those influence what's happening?
I would say that first and foremost, we had our honor code. We will not lie, steal, or cheat. And I think that was an integral part of how we presented this and formulated it, because we felt like when you have a leader who doesn't take care of their people, it's a lie in sort of a way. When you have a bad leader who doesn't respect and love their airmen, they're lying to their uniform, they're lying to their country. They're stealing tax money by not doing what they're called to do. And it's not an easy job. Everyone in this room has served in some capacity, and we understand the challenges of that, but that's what we were born and bred and trained to do, was to sacrifice personal for the betterment of society and for the furtherment of Western ideals.
Additionally, with a lot of the integrity first, service source, self-excellence in all we do, I think these are really, a lot of values that people subscribe to. So the challenge would be showing how moral harm needs to be addressed in order to allow these values to be propagated in the military. You can't have integrity unless you are keeping your moral compass maintained. You can't serve and put others before yourself unless you are taking care of yourself. You won't have the capability to. So the challenge won't be as much getting people to buy into these values, it'll be showing that you have to take care of your own morality and moral harm in order to be able to maintain these values.
I think as far as the Air Force Academy goes, our institution finds itself in kind of a state of flux. I think for 60 some odd years, we've nominally had our values in terms of the honor code and the Air Force values, but for a long time it was really nothing more than a pilot's academy. Almost everyone who graduated went on to pilot training, went on to be an aviator. But today we kind of find ourselves in a state of flux because we've diversified the career fields in which graduates can go into. So rather than being a pilot's academy where we have these leadership values that we talk about but don't really practice, we have to take those values today, and what we're doing is building people who are actually capable of leading airmen. And so we're taking these values which have nominally been in place for 6 decades and now forcing cadets to practice them and not just beating up on freshmen and underclassmen, but rather taking care of them, figuring out what's going on in their lives. And those are real things that you can take on into the active duty Air Force.
And that's all I have time for.